For centuries, the town of WIELICZKA has quietly existed on the edge of Krakow, known today mainly as a peaceful suburb with cafes, neat houses, and tourist buses lined up outside its famous salt mine. But very few people realize that beneath those everyday streets lies one of the most unusual, most elaborate, and most impossible underground constructions in all of Europe. An underground world that stretches for miles upon miles, descending deeper than modern skyscrapers are tall, carved with mathematical precision and artistic flourishes that seem strangely out of place for a supposedly simple medieval mine. This documentary explores the theory, strictly as a perspective, not a claim, that the WIELICZKA salt mine may be one of the last surviving megastructures inherited, modified, and repurposed over time, potentially originating from an earlier civilization whose engineering capabilities exceed what official timelines credit to medieval miners. In today's episode, we lay out the groundwork, the scale of the tunnels, the oddities of the architecture, the historical puzzles, and the big question that drives this entire four-part series. Why does this underground world seem so much more advanced, more symmetrical, more monumental, and more intentional than one would ever expect from people working with chisels in the 1200s? Before we go deeper into specific chambers in later episodes, we need to understand the context. WIELICZKA is officially believed to have begun in the 13th century, with miners laboriously carving salt from the rock, gradually forming rooms, shafts, and passageways as they followed mineral veins. Yet today, the mine spans over 180 miles of mapped tunnels, and possibly far more unmapped, descending down 9 levels and containing chapels, lakes, grand halls, perfectly geometric corridors, massive pillars, and strange architectural motifs that seem more suited to cathedrals or palaces rather than an industrial operation. And that's where our curiosity begins. How did miners working with medieval tools carve out rooms the size of modern sports auditoriums? Why do certain tunnels have perfectly smooth finishes and nearly ruler-straight alignments? Why are some chambers so dramatically overbuilt for the practical task of extracting salt? Why do underground lakes appear with carved staircases leading into them as if they once served a very different purpose? And why, when examining old photographs from the 1800s onward, does the mine appear so grand and intricately designed long before modern machinery ever entered the picture? These are the questions we will be exploring, not by claiming an alternate history, but by examining what enthusiasts of the Tartaria theory have long wondered, whether ancient subterranean networks may have existed in regions across Europe, and whether later cultures simply inherited, reworked, or expanded them. The WIELICZKA mine stands out because of its unbelievable scale. Most people who visit only see 1 to 2% of it, guided through a neat tourist route of carved statues, chandeliers made of salt, and chapels that look like something out of a Renaissance palace. But imagine the rest. Endless corridors, zigzagging like an underground city. ventilation shafts connecting levels with strange mathematical alignment, structural pillars carved so symmetrically they look machine-made, and chambers that feel ceremonial rather than industrial. Some tunnels are carved with such smooth curvature that one wonders how medieval workers even reached them, let alone shaped them. In this opening episode, we'll examine the official history, but also highlight peculiarities that raise eyebrows. For example, if the mine began in the 1200s and expanded slowly, why do some early records describe it as already enormous and well established? Why do sketches and engravings from centuries ago show vast rooms with architectural sophistication that doesn't match basic mining function? Why were certain lower levels sealed off for safety reasons with little documentation? And why do legends from the region talk about a mysterious underground realm long before mining supposedly began? One particularly strange detail: many underground chambers feature elaborate artistic flourishes, arches, reliefs, pillars, and smooth walls. This raises the question, were they created because miners had extra time and energy, or were they repurposed from something older? Again, we are not making claims, we are simply exploring the puzzle. Another curious element is the precision of the tunnels. For a medieval mine carved by hand, one would expect jagged walls, uneven floors, and chaotic shapes that follow salt veins randomly, but WIELICZKA has countless corridors with almost uncanny straightness. Some passages form symmetrical intersections, right angles, or parallel alignments reminiscent of architectural planning rather than raw excavation. And then you have the acoustics. In certain halls, sound carries with cathedral-like resonance, almost as if the space was intentionally engineered for gatherings or ceremonies. Meanwhile, underground lakes, naturally occurring according to the official narrative, sit in chambers with carved walkways and staircases. Why carve elegant paths into pitch-black lakes that had no practical mining purpose? In the 19th century, early photographs reveal large wooden structures, elaborate support beams, and corridors that already looked aged and monumental before modern reinforcement was added. These old photos often raise questions about how miners working centuries earlier kept such massive spaces structurally sound for so long. One of the greatest mysteries is the Chapel of St. Kinga, an enormous underground church carved entirely in salt, containing chandeliers, bas-reliefs, columns, and a floor polished so flat it resembles stone tiles. According to history, this chapel was carved by just 3 men over 60 years using primitive tools. It is a beautiful story, and maybe even true, but many viewers question how 3 men achieved such flawless architectural symmetry deep underground. Throughout this documentary, we will evaluate such questions from a respectful, speculative perspective. The WIELICZKA Enigma. In the quiet town of WIELICZKA, just outside Krakow, lies one of Europe's most baffling architectural achievements, a place so vast, so detailed, and so impossibly crafted that many visitors leave with the uncanny sense that they've witnessed something older than history itself. Today, in episode 2, we descend deep into this subterranean world, not to prove anything, not to insist on any rewritten history, but simply to explore an unusual perspective. What if the WIELICZKA salt mine is more than a mine? What if it represents a remnant, a surviving fragment of a forgotten architectural culture, often labeled under the umbrella idea of Tartaria? And what if its scale, precision, and engineering raise legitimate questions about who built it and when? We are not claiming this is true, only opening the door to what makes so many people suspicious in the first place. Imagine descending hundreds of feet into the earth and finding not rough caverns hacked crudely by miners, but vast cathedrals carved entirely out of salt, with ceilings that soar overhead in vaulted symmetry, chandeliers crafted from pure crystallized rock, staircases spiraling elegantly into deeper chambers, detailed sculptures, ornamental reliefs, and full-size rooms that mimic palaces, chapels, halls, and temples. If no one told you this was a mine, you might assume you were exploring some kind of ancient underground city, and that's where our journey begins. The official account states that the WIELICZKA salt mine began excavation in the 13th century, developed over centuries, and was worked consistently until 2007. That is the mainstream narrative, one repeated in tourist brochures, official museum descriptions, academic publications, and national heritage documents. And on the surface, it is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Humans have mined salt for millennia. Poland is rich in salt deposits. Technology improved over time. Simple. But once you descend into WIELICZKA, something becomes apparent immediately. The level of sophistication seems strangely out of place for the time periods associated with its construction. Again, not proof, but a curiosity that inspires questions. The chapels carved from salt, for instance, are astonishingly intricate. The most famous, the Chapel of St. Kinga, resembles a subterranean basilica more than anything else. Chandeliers hang from carved ceilings, altarpieces gleam with polished crystalline surfaces, and iconographic panels appear carved with the same precision as artisans working in marble above ground. Some visitors describe it as a reverse cathedral, a structure that feels like something carved downward rather than built upward, and that detail right there is what fuels alternative theories, because if you were trying to conceal or erase a civilization, the argument goes, you would destroy what is above ground. But what is underground? That is much harder to remove, and WIELICZKA gives the impression, purely from a visual and structural standpoint, that someone created not a mine, but an entire functioning architectural complex, then allowed later generations to repurpose it as they wished. One of the most puzzling aspects is scale. Official explanations claim it was carved slowly over centuries by miners using hand tools, gradually expanding chamber by chamber. But the sheer volume of removed material is staggering. Estimates vary, but the mine contains over 245 kilometers of passageways and hundreds of chambers carved into perfect geometric shapes. If this level of excavation truly occurred using medieval technology, one has to wonder, again, simply as a curious observer, how many lifetimes of labor it would have required. Add to that the presence of stairways, smooth-walled halls, ornate carvings, and uniformity of chamber shapes, and it begins to resemble something far more deliberate than a purely mining-focused layout. Many Tartaria researchers point out that the mine feels like the negative space of a building, as though the solid structure was removed, leaving behind the hollow form of what once existed. This perspective, though controversial and unsupported by mainstream academia, offers a strangely intuitive explanation for the symmetry and design If the chambers were originally architectural in purpose, they might make more sense. Now, let's examine one of the most striking mysteries: ventilation. Large underground complexes struggle with airflow, yet WIELICZKA maintains stable air circulation across a labyrinth of tunnels, some extending deep into the earth. Official explanations point to engineered ventilation shafts added over centuries. But when you consider the precision required to maintain oxygen levels across dozens of chambers carved at different depths, the achievement seems more advanced than what one might expect from early medieval engineering. Again, this is not a claim, but a reason why some theorists raise eyebrows. Another curiosity lies in the material itself. Carving salt is both delicate and dangerous. The wrong pressure can fracture entire walls. Yet the chambers stand perfectly stable, often shaped into arches, domes, and rectilinear rooms that look more like architectural spaces than mining cavities. If miners were simply extracting salt, why carve it in such elaborate, aesthetically pleasing forms? Why chiseled columns? Why vaulted ceilings? Why ornamental carvings? The obvious explanation is that it became a cultural site over time, with artistic additions layered onto older mining spaces. And this is almost certainly true to a degree. Yet the foundation of many chambers still looks too geometric, too harmonized, too intentional to be the accidental byproduct of salt extraction. Alternative researchers often compare these spaces to other underground sites worldwide. Derinkuyu in Turkey, the Hippodrome in Malta, the catacombs of Paris, all of which raise similar questions. Are these spaces mines, or are they remnants of something older, something possibly belonging to a civilization with a very different architectural language? Moving deeper, WIELICZKA contains another striking feature: underground lakes, perfectly still. Mirror-like pools appear at certain depths, glowing beneath soft lighting. While the official explanation is natural brine collecting in cavities, some visitors describe them as eerily symmetrical, almost like engineered reservoirs. And in many Tartarian-themed theories, water systems, aquifers, reservoirs, underground channels play a significant role, suggesting that ancient civilizations may have used water as a form of energy distribution or architectural reinforcement. Is there evidence for that in WIELICZKA? No. But the presence of these calm, structured pools gives the mine an atmosphere of hidden purpose, enough to fuel speculation. Another layer of mystery lies in the way the mine is presented historically. Large sections of archives documenting early excavation are lost, incomplete, or contradictory. Records from the 13th to 16th centuries are fragmented, inconsistent, or vague in their descriptions. Was this due to normal medieval record-keeping limitations? Almost certainly. But for those exploring alternative theories, it contributes to the sense of something being obscured or misinterpreted over centuries. One of the most powerful arguments made by Tartarian researchers is simply observational. If you showed someone photos of WIELICZKA without context, just images of the carved chapels, the huge halls, the underground structures, they would almost never guess salt mine. They would guess ancient temple, subterranean palace, or forgotten city. And that intuitive impression is what gives rise to the theories we are exploring today. Moving forward, let's consider the sheer artistry. Salt is a notoriously challenging medium. Too brittle for fine work, too soft for structural stability. Yet the carvings inside WIELICZKA are detailed to an almost absurd level of craftsmanship. as though workers carved rooms not to remove salts, but to create space. This has led to the idea that some chambers may have once had a purpose beyond mining. Was it storage, ritual, shelter, something else entirely? The mine also has acoustically interesting chambers. Sound travels in unusual ways. Whispers echo softly, footsteps resonate, music reverberates with cathedral-like richness. Was this intentional? Coincidental? Impossible to know. But it adds to the sense that the space feels more designed than excavated. Let's also consider the timeline. For a complex this large to exist solely through medieval mining would require a workforce of thousands over hundreds of years. And while Poland did have significant mining labor, the coordination and architectural consistency raise questions. Why are styles consistent across sections supposedly hundreds of years apart? Why do chambers carved during different reigns maintain similar proportions, symmetry, and aesthetic choices? Salt mines usually evolve chaotically. WIELICZKA evolves coherently. That alone is enough to inspire alternative interpretations. Towards the end of our descent today, let's consider something subtle but meaningful: the atmosphere. WIELICZKA simply doesn't feel like a mine. It feels like a monument, and monuments are built, not carved out in passing by miners. But again, we are not claiming anything definitively. Instead, we are presenting why so many people around the world look at WIELICZKA and sense that something is off, or at least not fully explained. The official story, while not wrong, leaves room for curiosity. And that curiosity is the foundation of this entire documentary series. In episode 3, we will take this further. We will explore the architectural inconsistencies, the engineering questions, and the unusual details that fuel Tartarian theories. We will compare WIELICZKA to other underground systems worldwide, and examine whether there are stylistic or structural parallels that point toward a forgotten global architectural tradition. But for now, as we conclude episode 2, one thing is undeniable. The WIELICZKA salt mine is not just impressive, it is baffling, beautiful, impossible, refined, vast, and enigmatic. Whether it is a medieval masterpiece or a remnant of something older, it continues to raise questions that echo through its halls. In this episode, we descend deeper into the WIELICZKA salt mine, not physically, but theoretically, historically, symbolically, and architecturally, because at this point, the official explanations begin to wobble, and the questions become louder than the answers. The further down you go into this mine, the more the structure begins to resemble something that should not logically exist beneath a medieval Polish town built by people who supposedly had only primitive mining tools and limited engineering knowledge. And yet we're told that the chambers, domes, pillars, vaulted halls, chapels, stair systems, bridges, carved structures, and entire underground cathedral-like spaces were all carved patiently by hand, slowly, gradually, over centuries with the kind of precision and geometric intentionality you normally associate with grand engineers of the industrial age. In this episode, we simply ask the viewer to slow down and examine the architectural features of the WIELICZKA salt mine not as tourist attractions and not as quaint historical engineering, but as structures displaying a level of symmetry, scale, planning, and load-bearing knowledge that feels out of place. We have been told many times that the mine is old, very old, older than most modern nations. But age doesn't automatically explain ability, and ability does not automatically match the supposed conditions of the people who built it. When we look at the scale of the chambers, some being the size of cathedrals, some with ceilings so high you'd expect flying buttresses to hold them up, something becomes clear. These were not simple rooms dug out for salt extraction. These were purposeful, reinforced architectural environments, behaving like underground complexes constructed with intention rather than improvised with chisels and hammers. So, in episode 3, let us begin at the point where the depth, design, and geometry start raising suspicion. One of the most famous chambers in the mine is the Chapel of St. Kinga, an elaborate underground hall carved entirely from salt. Tourists today stand in awe at the chandeliers, salt columns, relief carvings, staircases, and perfect proportions. But instead of simply admiring it, let us look closely at the engineering. The chamber, to exist safely, requires an understanding of structural weight distribution and ceiling support. It is not simply a room carved out. It is an engineered space. Its ceiling height is nearly 12 meters. It stretches long enough that sound carries with near perfect acoustics. It contains carved staircases that look as if someone planned them into the blueprint rather than improvised them while digging. If you showed this chamber to someone without context, they might guess it was built by a medieval underground guild with advanced tools, or perhaps by a forgotten sect of architectural monks. But the official narrative says no. This was carved by miners using primitive tools over centuries bit by bit without any overarching architectural plan. But when you see how symmetrical the chamber is, how smooth the surfaces are, how the proportions and measurements line up with the exactness of a cathedral, it begins to resemble something else, something designed with foresight rather than carved with trial and error. That's where the Tartarian perspective enters. Not as a declaration, but as a question. If one were to imagine an older civilization, one familiar with underground construction, one capable of designing reinforced subterranean halls, what would their work resemble? It would probably resemble something like the Chapel of St. Kinga. Next, let's consider the massive timber structures used deeper in the mine to reinforce the tunnels. These wooden supports are enormous. Some look like sections of ancient ship hulls flipped sideways and wedged into the earth. The official explanation is that these were installed throughout the mine over the centuries as needed. But again, the scale raises questions. Why are the supports so massive? Why do they resemble engineered frameworks instead of makeshift braces? Why do they appear standardized, almost factory-produced, when the tools and industrial capacity to produce uniform beams like this supposedly didn't exist at the time many were first installed? And if the original tunnels were dug in the 1200s with simple tools, how were such massive beams maneuvered, fitted, and raised in the deep underground corridors? The further you go into the mine, the more questions arise. Some chambers have almost perfectly arched ceilings, not the random jagged ceilings you'd expect from mining, but smooth, symmetrical vaults, the kind used in ancient architecture to distribute pressure and prevent collapse. These shapes are familiar to architects studying Roman, Byzantine, and medieval stone construction, but finding them deep inside a salt mine is unusual. Another perspective is the geological one. Salt is soft and shifts over time. Creating large chambers without collapse requires both expertise and ongoing maintenance. But what if some chambers were not mined for salt at all, but created first and repurposed later? The theory here is not that the WIELICZKA salt mine was a Tartarian facility, but that parts of it may have been adapted, reinforced, or recarved in ways that obscure older layers of construction. In some areas, walls appear smoothed beyond what mining tools of the era could easily produce. Some staircase systems are more elaborate than necessary. Some chambers resemble ceremonial halls more than extraction zones. In this episode, we also examine the geometry of the mine. Many corridors intersect at precise angles, forming structured layouts rather than chaotic branching tunnels. While mining operations often follow predictable paths based on deposits, the layout of WIELICZKA is unusually orderly. Some intersections appear deliberately placed at exact 90-degree orientations. Some chambers align with surprising symmetry relative to each other, despite being carved centuries apart. These features would require mapping, surveying, and planning. Much earlier than the official timeline suggests miners possessed these skills at scale. The deeper we go into the mine, the more the architecture resembles the logic of a hidden underground complex. Some rooms have high ceilings shaped into domes, which serve no purpose in salt extraction, but do serve structural and acoustic functions. Some shafts descend in perfectly vertical lines much longer than expected for medieval engineering. Then there is the mystery of water management inside the mine. WIELICZKA has an elaborate system of channels, lakes, pumps, and reservoirs. Some of these systems seem overly advanced for their earliest known construction dates. The redirection of underground waters requires mathematical knowledge, and yet the official narrative says medieval miners figured it out with trial and error. But when you see the precision of the channels, the smooth curvature of the carved salt pools, and the vertical shafts that align with drainage routes, it begins to resemble the work of someone who already understood hydroengineering. This is where Tartarian theorists begin to speculate, not asserting but simply wondering whether the mine's original structure might predate the earliest historical records. Not necessarily the entire mine, but certain pathways, certain chambers, certain foundational architectural decisions. In episode 3, we also examine the artistic and symbolic carvings inside the mine. We're told they were made by miners during their off hours, carving saints, figures, and decorative reliefs into salt for spiritual comfort. But some carvings are so refined, so detailed, so expertly proportioned that they resemble formal sculpture rather than hobbyist attempts. The mine begins to feel like the basement level of a lost architectural complex. Some Tartarian theorists imagine that at least parts of the mine align with the concept of underground storage facilities, escape routes, or ceremonial chambers, repurposed later as mining zones. While this is speculative, it becomes tempting to consider because the architecture fits both a practical and symbolic template. In another section of the episode, we consider the sheer manpower required. Officially, thousands of workers over hundreds of years carved the mine, but the consistency of design across centuries is striking. How did generations of miners somehow maintain architectural continuity without a master blueprint? How did they preserve symmetrical proportions when the workers of one era would never meet the workers 2 centuries later? It would require extensive record keeping, long-term planning, and knowledge transfer beyond what is typically documented. For Tartarian theorists, this raises the possibility that the mine's foundational architecture existed earlier, serving as a template for later expansions. In this view, miners may have adapted parts of an older complex for salt extraction, smoothing walls, adding carvings, reinforcing ceilings, but not necessarily creating everything from scratch. Another feature worth mentioning is the elevator shafts that descend deep into the earth. Today they are modernized, but the earlier shafts, while more primitive, were still incredibly deep and straight. How were perfect vertical shafts created without advanced surveying instruments? How was ventilation maintained before industrial technology? The mine's airflow is still impressive today. Official explanations credit clever medieval engineering, but when you see the scale, long tunnels, tall chambers, interconnected shafts, all ventilating flawlessly, it begins to resemble ventilation systems from much later eras. Deep beneath the quiet Polish town of WIELICZKA, beyond the souvenir shops and the tourist queues, far past the comfortable stairways and modern lighting, there is a world that does not behave like a simple mine. If the first 3 episodes were about what the WIELICZKA salt mine is, then this final episode asks what it might have been. And this is where the story becomes strange, because when you follow the clues, the architecture, the scale, the engineering, and the mystery, you eventually stop asking how it was dug and start asking whether digging was even the original point. In today's closing chapter, we step away from the accepted explanations and venture into an alternative framework, not declaring it true, but examining the possibility that the WIELICZKA salt mine may have been a repurposed Tartarian subterranean complex adapted by later hands into the mine we claim it always was. There is a reason this idea persists. It begins with depth, not the depth itself, but the consistency of depth. WIELICZKA is said to have been dug steadily for 7 centuries by hand, shovel, pickaxe, livestock, and basic lifting devices. Yet the chambers, particularly the deepest, widest ones, possess a symmetry and structural accuracy inconsistent with medieval hand tool excavation. The mining story claims the layout expanded organically over time. Yet the geometry says the opposite. It resembles a pre-designed underground city divided into sectors, halls, transport routes, and service zones, as though part of a unified architectural blueprint. There is even a recurring width used throughout the major corridors, a repeating pattern, almost modular, raising the question, why would different groups of miners across centuries unknowingly carve to the exact same proportions? The next curiosity lies in the pillars. In conventional mining, pillars are left behind in irregular shapes, determined by stress patterns and necessity. In WIELICZKA, however, the supporting columns appear intentionally geometric, sculpted, rounded, and squared off, as though crafted rather than abandoned material. Some look carved, shaped, polished, Some appear to have decorative symmetry, even though the official story insists they were formed purely for functionality. These shapes resemble load-bearing supports of monumental underground architecture more than rough mining residue. And then, of course, there is the infamous Chapel of Saint Kinga. Officially, miners carved it slowly over centuries. Unofficially, it looks suspiciously like a pre-existing cavern that was later modified to appear as a devotional chapel. The smooth vaulting, the enormous spatial volume, the acoustics, yes, the acoustics, do not match the chisel marks celebrated in tourist brochures. They match something closer to engineered resonance, the kind used in ancient temples. And it is the acoustics that bring us to one of the oddest theories, that WIELICZKA may have functioned not simply as a salt source or storage area, but as a resonance chamber. Salt reflects sound differently than stone. It carries vibration in softer, lower frequencies. Large underground halls of salt exhibit unique wave properties that could theoretically amplify natural energy, sound, magnetism, or even primitive electricity. Tartaria theories often involve forgotten energy systems. So from this angle, WIELICZKA begins to look less like a mine and more like an infrastructure component. Not the power plant itself, but a stabilizing node, a regulator vault, a resonance buffer. The idea is speculative, yes, but it answers certain questions. Why carve halls far larger than needed for salt production? Why polish some surfaces but leave others raw? Why connect chambers with long, straight tunnels rather than shorter diagonal ones more typical of resource extraction? Why carve vast underground lakes? Yes, the lakes. Officially, they are groundwater-filled chambers left behind from extraction. Yet some of them have unnaturally smooth edges, with carved ledges that form walkways along the water's edge. A few have perfectly flat, mirrored surfaces with no apparent inflow or outflow. Others reflect light in ways that resemble intentional design, as if meant to diffuse illumination more efficiently throughout the space, which brings us to lighting. Before electricity, miners used torches, lamps, and candles, but salt corrodes flame housings quickly. Salt also absorbs soot poorly, meaning the ceilings should be heavily stained after centuries of torch use. Yet many ceilings are strangely clean. Some even look as though they were designed to reflect light downward more effectively. A strange consideration for medieval miners, but a practical design choice for an advanced civilization using non-flame-based illumination. And then there's the legend, a small one, rarely mentioned but persistent. It states that some of the deepest tunnels were sealed long before miners found them. Not collapsed, not unstable, sealed intentionally with smooth cuts, as though doors or barriers once existed deeper inside. The earliest mining maps show forbidden zones, areas not labeled, not described, simply marked with diagonal hatching. When asked, modern guides attribute these to flooded or unsafe passages. Yet some of them exist at elevations and angles where flooding makes no logical sense. Something was there, something was closed, and no one opens it now. Episode 4 is not here to claim Tartaria built WIELICZKA. It is here to explore why WIELICZKA feels older, stranger, and more engineered than the mining narrative allows. Consider the transport routes. Some shafts are large enough for freight elevators long before freight elevators existed. Some corridors are wide enough for vehicles, yet mining carts of that era were narrow and simple. Some ramps descend at perfectly consistent gradients, engineered like modern infrastructure. Why? And consider the carvings. Some sculptures in the mine are, of course, recent, tourist-friendly creations. but others, like the reliefs on the older walls, appear significantly more ancient than their assigned dates. They resemble stylized art motifs found in early European stonework, but with an oddly refined consistency, as though they were copying something older, as though they found these walls and touched them up to fit their story, as though the mine itself predates the miners. Another curiosity is the sheer size of the underground footprint. WIELICZKA covers over 150 miles of tunnels across multiple levels. Yet the town above it was never large enough to support such a colossal workforce. If the mine truly required hundreds of workers per generation, why is there no corresponding population boom? Why do the town records not match the scale of labor supposedly required? Why do the workforce numbers fluctuate inexplicably across historical archives? Theories range from the practical to the extraordinary. Some believe the mine began as natural caverns expanded slightly by early cultures, later adopted by medieval miners. Others believe it may have been an underground refuge, a storage site, a sanctuary, or even a subterranean palace complex from a forgotten civilization, one that used salt for preservation, acoustics, or even insulation. Some point to its ventilation system, bafflingly effective long before industrial engineering. Others point to its drainage, precise, directional, and controlled. Some ask why the deeper one goes, the more architectural the chamber shapes become. And the strangest theory of all, that WIELICZKA was not an isolated anomaly, but one node in a vast network of underground structures across Europe, later claimed as mines, cellars, catacombs, or drainage tunnels. In this view, WIELICZKA is simply the largest one that survived. The rest were collapsed, sealed, forgotten, or repurposed over time. The theory does not ask the viewer to accept it as fact. It simply asks, why does the largest, deepest, most elaborate salt mine on Earth look more like a forgotten city than an industrial site? Why does its architecture resemble engineering rather than accidental carving? Why are some chambers impossibly smooth while others are jagged? Why are some hallways perfectly straight while others are chaotic? Why do ventilation shafts behave too efficiently for their claimed era? Why are there sealed tunnels, mapped but never opened, with no official explanation? Why does it feel like a place that was not built but inherited? And if it was inherited, who built it originally, and why? Episode 4 concludes with the possibility, not a claim, not a declaration, but a possibility that beneath WIELICZKA lies something humanity has forgotten, something overwritten by later stories, something too large, too strange, too engineered, too improbable for the official narrative to comfortably contain. Whether it was a resonance chamber, an underground complex, a retreat, a vault, or something entirely different, the truth is simple. WIELICZKA is older in spirit, deeper in meaning, and more mysterious in its construction than its historical label suggests. And somewhere behind a sealed door, down a forbidden passage, or beneath a silent lake, the original purpose of this impossible underground world may still be waiting.